Welcome back if you were with us last week for our first Behavioral Health Tuesday. If you were not here with us last week, welcome. My name is Lindsay. I'm the program administrator for the Center for Evidence to Practice. If you're not familiar with our work, we are a collaboration between the LSU-HSC School of Public Health in New Orleans and the Louisiana Department of Health. And our mission is to support the state in expanding access to evidence-based behavioral health programs for children and families in the Medicaid system. So we have been offering these Behavioral Health Tuesdays. This week is the second one on the secondary impact of trauma through a SAMHSA grant for the state. If you are interested in watching the first one and you were not here last week, I'm going to post the link to our e-learning platform, E2P Learn. And I did send it out as well in an email with the handout for today. But if you don't have an account yet, you'll have to register, and then you'll be able to view the webinar. We will be posting the series of 3 in that same course. And once all 3 are posted, you'll be able to watch all 3 and get a 3-hour CEU certificate. But because the first one is only posted now, you won't be able to get CEUs until all 3 are posted. But the checkmark system for completing the courses, if you only need it for part of them, you'll be able to see how to do that through the course on E2P Learn. And feel free to email us if you have any issues navigating that. All right, so please stay for at least 45 minutes today in order to qualify for today's CEU session. If you call in by phone, please shoot us a message through chat or email to let us know your name. Otherwise, we won't know who you are for CEU purposes. And other than that, just a reminder that we are recording today's session. So if we do have the opportunity to share, just keep that in mind that the session is recorded. All right, so I will hand it over to Dr. Philippi. He is the director for the Center for Evidence to Practice and the facilitator for these Behavioral Health Tuesday sessions.
Excellent. Thank you, Lori. And thanks. Welcome back to everybody that was here last time. It's always great when people show back up. It either says they really need CEUs or they enjoyed what they had last time, or they need both, one or the other. And I did enjoy Lori popped in the comment with her little picture of the sunshine. That would be my first question for y'all, is why are you even here? It's beautiful outside. Why aren't you using your vacation day? But I am not using a vacation day, and I've been looking at the beautiful sunshine all day. So, just I am Stephen Philippi. I work for Louisiana LSU School of Public Health, Chair of Behavioral and Community Health and Director for the center. Just reminder, same rules as last time. I see you all are already popping stuff in the chat, which is awesome. We used it a lot last week. We're going to use it a lot this week. I'm also going to ask somebody to turn on their mic at some point and read something to us, so I'm not just reading it at you all. But just remember, it's like conferences and all meetings. You know, if you whatever you would say in a conference would be the same thing. I think you'd feel free to share in this gathering, remote conference. So all of that being said, we'll jump in so we can get done on time. And there was a handout for today. If you didn't see it in your email, you may want to go back and check for your email from Lindsay or the Center for Evidence to Practice. You know, when you registered, one of the handouts for today outside of the slides was a instrument called the ProQuil, and we are going to get to that at one point. So I'll show it to you. Hopefully, it won't be a big stumbling block, but you can also do it after the presentation. So without further ado, let's go. Still excited, humbled, truly appreciative that we have so many people interested in not only taking care of themselves, but taking care of those that are in their care. And thanks for being here, just to have a frank, open discussion about some of this. Today is actually one of my favorite topics. I wish somebody had told me this when I was studying to be a clinician, when I was working on studying social work, working on my license. Very glad that we figured this stuff out many years later. But oh my God, this would have changed a lot of things in my world if I had known some of this stuff earlier. So before we jump into it, just curious, where y'all at? So what's going on? How are you doing this week? Good, stressed, unstressed? You've been working on those plans of self-care from last week. How are you doing? So Nona's awesome, enjoying wonderful weather, good, stressed, week is manageable, good. That's always a good thing, right? Busy but hanging in there, blessed, good. The weather does definitely help. Lisa, I agree. Busy but managing. So yes, stress, but gorgeous weather, it always makes it better. A lot of people loving this good weather, good. Hanging in there, busy. All right. So where we were last week was on self-care. And like Lindsay mentioned, we started, there's a recording of it. If anybody's interested, you can certainly go back and watch it. Today, we're going to focus on trauma and secondary trauma. And then next week, we'll come back and we'll talk about really what is this issue that we have, especially in the face of the pandemic, with collective trauma, response, disasters, grief, resilience, all that, and we'll focus on that next week. All right, so those of y'all with me last week, remember we did this at the end, after we did the breathing exercise at the beginning. We're gonna switch it up and we're gonna do this at the beginning. For all of y'all that said you had a stressed week. So again, reminder, don't hurt yourself. This is not meant to be painful. This is meant to actually relax your muscles. So we start with, I'm not sure which side is which on y'all's screen, but we'll start with the woman in the chair sitting up straight. We're literally gonna put our hands behind our neck, support your neck, but you're going to push and you're gonna really flex muscles in your neck and your back and your arms, and you're gonna push back and push down on the floor. And when the whole point to this is to tighten up your muscles as much as you feel comfortable doing, but tighten them up, because we're going to cause a lot of tension purposely. And we're just going to hold it for a few seconds. Lots of tension. And then you literally, I just want you to let it all go and just drop, like the guy in the slouch in the chair. And you can feel all that good stuff just getting out of your muscles, all that tension just released, let it go. One of my favorite exercises. I saw some of y'all's notes from last time saying you liked it as well. You can do it longer. I just don't want to push anybody and have people hurt themselves. So just a quick reminder from last week, right? So stress isn't all bad, right? You've got good stress, you've got bad stress. And low demands, boredom, depression, all that kind of stuff. If you have too little stress, you actually don't function well. If you have just the right amount of stress, you start performing well, right? And I saw that in a lot of you when I asked where y'all were at. You know, you've got a lot on your plate, but you're managing it. Stress, but you're getting through it this week. That's kind of where you want to be. What we're going to pay more attention to today is what happens when these demands exceed our abilities, or when they hit this chronic or excessive stress phase. So different kinds of stress, different kinds of reaction. So we're going to start at one end, and we're going to talk about compassion fatigue. Then we're going to talk about vicarious trauma. We're going to talk a little bit about secondary traumatic stress, and then we're going to come full circle to how do you best fight that as a person on the front lines, helping people out. So one of the cool and unfortunate things of the job that most of us signed up for, begged for, went to school for, wanted to do, however you want to else explain it, we're allowed to help people in some of their very worst moments. So just let that sink in for a second, because that's what we signed up to do, right? We want to help people, and a lot of it is helping people in their very worst moments. So all those worst moments can accumulate over time, right? Because this is what we do day in, day out, working with people. And it can lead to compassion fatigue. Sometimes it looks like burnout, right? And you've probably heard a lot about burnout. We use that term often just in terms of colloquial discussions and all that stuff. You know, I feel so burnt out. I'm just burnt out on this. I'm burnt out on that. It's like that. But when we're talking about helping professions, it's literally something that's really important is having compassion for the populations we work with. And we start really just getting tired of being compassionate. Our burnout looks a little bit different than sometimes other people's burnout, other professions' burnout. And it's less about the traumatic event, and it's more about the constant exposure as you're trying to be compassionate, as you're trying to offer care, that constant exposure to the troubles of others. And it takes a toll. And we know it from the research, we know it from the literature. So here's where I said I would ask somebody to turn off their mic. Don't make me have to call on you. Just somebody, anybody. I don't want to read this to you. I want somebody to turn, did I say turn off your mic? Sorry. Turn on your mic and read this out loud. And I'm going to warn you, it's 2 slides. So you're going to read this one. I'll flip to the next one. But somebody read this out loud for us, please.
Compassion fatigue is the result of becoming worn down and emotionally weary from hearing about and dealing with the chat boxes and like situations where people have been physically and emotionally injured, hospitalized, and all too often killed. These are people who suffer on our watch, so to speak. These cases have a way of creeping into our lives, and that is only natural if you care about and are engaged in your work. I have come to understand that cases affect us in many ways. For me, the volume and nature of the cases can sometimes be overwhelming. Indeed, even one case can be devastating, and most of my colleagues can recall a profoundly tragic individual case, even though it occurred years ago.
Great.
The symptoms of CF are fairly predictable. Some reported internalized symptoms, including sleeplessness, eating disturbances, increased anxiety, depression, and hypervigilance. Others reported external symptoms, including becoming increasingly angry, irritable, and intolerant of others. Some reported increased fearfulness and the inability to make prompt decisions or procrastination, and increased difficulty focusing or concentrating. Some felt quite ambivalent and therefore anxious about critical decisions. While most people experience one or more of these emotions or behaviors at some point in their lives, the frequency and intensity of the symptoms seem to elevate when we are responsible for the lives of others.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bridget. You did fantastic. So several of y'all, when we were talking about self-care last week, and I just asked the question, how do you know you're stressed, right? Some of y'all said these, you know, the intolerance, the irritability, the lashing, or not lashing out, but, you know, that angry, increasingly get angry. Some of the other symptoms, depression, anxiety, things like that. So some of y'all describe that. So I've got a quick trivial quiz for you. Some of y'all may know this, but I'm always surprised. Because the one thing that I'd ask is, who do you think this guy Michael Town is? Anybody have an idea? Take a guess. What do you think his profession is?
Is he a social worker?
That would be a great guess. And if I read that with no context, I would say the same thing. I see Nonis as a coach. So the answer is Michael Town is actually a judge. This blew me away. One of the things, probably one of the most humbling experiences I've ever had in my life was being asked by the judges of Louisiana to do a retreat for them about this very issue, vicarious trauma, and about not just vicarious trauma, but secondary trauma. The rate at which judges, and you can imagine, just similar to a lot of us as we hear day in, day out, the troubles and concerns and the pressures and stress of other people, in a judge's role, this is exactly what they do too. They're hearing all these details of people's just horrendous things that happen in people's lives. And so Michael Town is a judge, and he's a big advocate of trying to train people and teach people about vicarious trauma. So there you go. Michael Town's a judge, but all of us, any of us that are in a helping profession that intervenes in people and some of their people's lives in some of their worst moments can certainly relate. All right. So where is all this coming from, right? Where does vicarious trauma come from? Where does compassion fatigue? Where does all this burnout that we're talking about come from? And it's trauma, right? And including what we've been doing for the last year. And I think if I heard correctly on the radio today is actually the 1-year anniversary of the very first case of COVID in Louisiana. All of this builds up, and that trauma is associated with these things we're going to talk about today. So trauma, right? This is trauma 101. This is not going to shock any of you all. This is what we're trained and we know, right? But you've got the fight, flight, or freeze. You've got that threat, that immediate threat, and all your adrenaline, cortisol, your heart rate, glucose, all of those things that you have in your body go off like they're supposed to, right? And remember, this is what's supposed to happen. Some of y'all are freaking out already because you got this giant snake with fangs on your screen, and I'm sorry for that. But there's no complex thought going on. You're not sitting here thinking, oh, should I sit here and have a conversation with this snake? Should I, try and give it a hug and give it some compassion? No, you just automatically go into natural response, right? So you're not weighing a whole lot of options. You're not dealing with a whole lot of higher order thinking. You're reacting at this point. And that's what trauma does, right? It causes us to react. It's survival mode. So all of that works great when you're faced with some horrible water moccasin in Louisiana, or some bear out in the woods, if you like going that way, or if you like swimming at the beach, where I definitely would love to be, but then you've got a shark in the water. I mean, all of these things work really well when faced with these real threats. However, right, that crisis event starts changing in the face of repeated exposure trauma. And especially in this year that we've had, right? If you just think about turning on the news, and what we hear is more and more crisis, more crisis. You start going to work. I was almost going to pull the traffic thing off, but for those of y'all that are from Baton Rouge, oh my God, traffic's back. I hadn't been to Baton Rouge in a year, and I had to go to meetings. Was it last week or the week before? The traffic in Baton Rouge is once again horrible. All of those things are triggers. But, traffic's just traffic unless we start having an overreaction to it, right? The news is just the news unless we start taking all this in and it's building up. And our bodies start treating it as trauma because our brains don't know the difference. If our brains and our bodies start treating these things as trauma, this overexposure, this constant exposure, your brain wants to do exactly what it's designed to do, which is protect you. It's kept us alive for billions of years. So protecting you is where it's at. You want it to activate your alarm system, right? But when in the face of things that aren't immediately threatening you, do you want all that free-floating anxiety? Do you want that depression, the pessimism that comes, the irritability? So one of the things that we've got to figure out is in the face of being helpers, where we're working with people with so much trauma, including our own over the past year, right? We got to figure out what happens because our thinking brain is being reduced to a traumatic brain where we're reacting, right? A lot of times, and we're overwhelming our own systems while trying to do good for others. So 2 things I told you we'd cover today, right? So we started talking about compassion fatigue. I'm going to get a little bit deeper into the weeds of as compassion fatigue gets unsettled or does not get resolved and it continues on, it can get worse and you can get to things like vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma is exactly what the judge was explaining in that quote. The cumulative effect, right? The cumulative effect of hearing and working with survivors of traumatic life events. This isn't your trauma, right? But it occurs when people engage empathically. We're going to come back to that. But that's what makes us vulnerable. And then it's related to this idea of secondary traumatic stress, which is a little bit different. We're going to save that towards the end. But then it starts looking like we have PTSD and we didn't even encounter the event that we're helping people through. So those are the kind of things that we're going to talk about. And then we complicate all of this with a pandemic year where it's not only helping people through their own stress and trauma, but we've got a foot in both doors, right? We've got a foot in trying to help people, and we've got a foot in our own traumatic experiences from the past year. The people we've lost, our own threats to our health, those of you that have had COVID yourself, the stress of that, the stress of the new stresses of caretaking, all sorts of stuff that we did not plan for coming into this year. Hopefully it makes sense. Let's see, next slide. So the risk factors. So what are the risk factors for this vicarious trauma, right? Or worst case scenario, secondary traumatic stress. Engaging empathically. And this is going to sound crazy, but this is what does it. And we're going to hear this over and over again as these slides continue. The thing that puts most of us at risk as helpers is our ability to be empathic, to show empathy for another person, their place, their condition, their trauma, their experience. The more empathy, the more risk factors we have. So you all actually alluded to one of the ways that we are resilient, even being empathic last week, and I'm going to circle back to that. But engaging empathically, and I'm not just talking about the role of being sympathetic with people and all that, or even just being compassionate, but I'm talking about when you're in a helping profession where you're really walking with that person and really seeing things from their viewpoint, which we know builds trust and builds rapport, which then changes behavior. But the more we engage in empathy with another human being, not only imagining walking in their shoes, but literally getting to that place where you can feel empathy in a room when it happens, right? It's that place where if I were you, thinking the way you're thinking, seeing the things that you're seeing, everything you've explained to me, if I were you, I'd probably be reacting and feeling that same way that you're describing. That's when you're getting tapped down in empathy, right? Not just, hey, I understand you, I get where you're coming from, but you're really trying to be there with the person. Anyway, whole world of empathy training we'll leave to another time. Other things that make you at risk. Measuring your self-worth by how much you help others. And you all know, we've got 111 people on this call. You all know who you are, right? I've been there, done that one. Why I got into social work. I wanted to save the world. I was the social justice. That was my passion in this world. I was going to go out and save it, right? I've learned a little bit of wisdom since then. That was many, many years ago. But you start measuring your own self-worth by how much you help others puts you at risk because you're not going to help everybody. So you're gonna hit that fatigue. You're going to hit that stress. Having unrealistic expectation, fear of being able to show your own weaknesses, that you can't solve it all, you can't figure it all out, you can't even figure out everything in your own life, right? Fear of being judged for not being able to do your job. And there's a lot of pressures, right? There's a lot of pressures to be able to do your job well. Discomfort with offers of emotional support. So when other people even want to extend their help to you, and you're like, no, I'm the helper, right? That's my role. And not letting other people help you. And then the last of the risk factors that I'm just going to highlight is this risk factors: repeated exposure to traumatic material. This is the job, again, we signed up for. Life is traumatic. It's a guarantee. There's no one way. There's no way around it. Life is hard. Harder for some than others, but life is hard. There is always going to be trauma in life. That's part of the life course for whatever reason. You guys can take it up with God or whatever and ask for all that infinite wisdom, but it's part of life, is right. It's hard and it's traumatic. And then we sign up as helpers to help people through lots of traumatic stuff. So we're exposing ourselves purposely. This is what we do, repeatedly exposing ourselves to traumatic material. Other risk factors, inability to say no. You guys said it last time, but y'all talked about how do you stay healthy, and so many of y'all put in your plans about boundaries, your ideas about how to stay healthy. So we'll talk about boundaries some more today. But that inability to say no is not good for you. Letting work bleed over to your personal time, and hold that thought, because I'm going to come back to that next slide. And then exposure to survivors' strong emotions, right? When we're exposed to traumatic material, it's not in the context of just like reading a news story or hearing a little brief of traumatic material from a radio show or a TV show. We're actually exposed to the details of someone's trauma and how much it's affected them, how much it hurt, how much despair they had. And that's what we do as helpers. And then you combine that with several of y'all, and you know who you are, your perfectionism. And we know nobody can do this perfect, and it's hard. So I'm going to go back to letting work bleed over to your personal time. Oh, I jumped the clip. We're going to come back to it. So remember that, letting work bleed over to your personal time. We're going to come back to it, promise. All right, so all this builds up to the possibility of vicarious trauma. So reporting your own trauma symptoms as a result of responding to victims of trauma. This was not your trauma. This is somebody else. You're responding, but you're developing your own symptoms of trauma, right? So what are the symptoms of trauma? Y'all hit the chat button. I know y'all know how to use that chat button. What's the symptoms of trauma? What are some of the things when we say people are experiencing trauma? How do we know? What are the signs and symptoms? Avoidance, anxiety, agitation. Y'all are rocking this. Flashbacks, fear, good. Yeah, all of that stuff, right? Sleep disturbances, increased stress, self-isolation, fantastic. Reoccurring thoughts, right? Guilt, stress, lashing out, eating disturbances, shutting down. All right, so you guys know what I'm talking about. So this is when we look at other people and we say, you've got trauma going on in your world. Those are the symptoms we're looking at, but now we start suffering from those same symptoms, and it's not because we went through that trauma, it's because we heard it from the victims of that trauma, or even a better term might be the survivors of that trauma, right? It's a very personal experience because we help people. This is what we do. And it is, what we do is we expose ourselves. We sign up to expose ourselves to the stories, the cruel, inhumane acts that are often perpetrated on human beings, right? And populations, etc. So this is part of the work we do. So we're setting ourselves up for the high likelihood of vicarious trauma. So what does the American Counseling Association say it is? The best, shortest definition. It's that emotional residue of exposure, right? From working with people as we hear their trauma stories, come witness to their pain, fear, terror, and the trauma that they have endured. So I just want you to take a few seconds and just think, what has been some of the residue of this year? The things that you've heard, the things that you've been exposed to in your helping profession. And I'm not even talking about your own life yet. I'm just talking about the stuff that you've been exposed to, the people that you try to help. And you know, load up that chat with some of the things that you've heard. Death due to COVID. Absolutely. Hopelessness, substance abuse, grief, and very complex grief, as people haven't even been able to grieve like we have been historically. Domestic abuse, worry, more acting out, isolation, good. Couples discord, abusive parents. Sure, isolation, I would put an exclamation point on isolation, isolation. Isolation has caused so much problems this year. Child abuse, increased incarceration, absolutely. Grief, unemployment, absolutely. So, people that are already feeling helpless in a situation, becoming more helpless as they've lost their jobs and they've lost their means to sustain themselves. Despair, loss of homes, domestic violence, food insecurity. Wow. All right, so y'all have heard this. You're not just hearing this on the news. This is the world that you all work in. 4 hurricanes, winter storms, and COVID. Lest we forget. Thank you, Danita. So that's the stuff that we've been exposed to over the past course of the last year. So all of us are in danger of vicarious trauma, right? Some of us may get to the point of secondary traumatic stress. So what makes that difference, vicarious trauma? It's the amount, right? Just like when we talk about trauma versus post-traumatic stress disorder, we talk about trauma. Everybody that has PTSD has trauma, right? Symptoms, signs, and symptoms, but not everybody that has trauma exposure ends up with PTSD. Same thing here. Everybody that has secondary traumatic stress has vicarious trauma, if that's the case, but you don't necessarily get to secondary traumatic stress just because you have vicarious trauma. So symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. Now we're starting to see some of those same signs, but at the level that we would consider almost post-traumatic stress disorder, but not through your own experience, through someone else's experience that you are re-experiencing. You're avoiding, you're numbing, you have that persistent arousal because of somebody else's experience that you have walked with them in trying to help. And again, I told you empathy was going to be woven into this. And we're going to try and solve this problem of empathy, because you can't do what we do without empathy. But empathy has been identified as one of the common mechanisms to transfer between primary and secondary trauma. So the more empathic you are, the better you are at your job in a lot of ways. As you empathize, you build rapport, you build trust, the more that you increase your likelihood to vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress. So I told you at the beginning of this, professional quality of life scale. So that went out from Lindsay. If you got it, I'm going to literally pause, and I'm just going to hit silent for a minute or two while you, if you want to take the Procol, you can, because I'm going to go through it. This is for educational purposes, right? I'm not diagnosing you. I'm not screening you. I'm not treating you, any of that kind of stuff. This is for your own self-edification. It's a great tool. And certainly if you work with other professionals that are suffering their own burnout and compassion fatigue and potential vicarious trauma and everything for the work they do, feel free to consider using this. But you've got the Procol, and it basically goes like this. So when you help people, you have direct contact with their lives. As you may have found, your compassion for those you help can affect you in positive and negative ways. So it's not all bad. This story isn't all bad. And this is one of the things I love about the Procol. Below are some questions about your experience, both positive and negative as a helper. Consider each of the following questions about you and your current work situation. Select the number that honestly reflects how frequently you experience these things in the last 30 days. So consider the last month. We're in March. So think back to February. And how was this? Did you never experience it? Rarely, sometimes, often, or very often? And so I'm going to encourage you to take the Procol. I'm going to show you real quickly. For those of y'all that have it, great. For those that don't, I'm going to show you what it looks like so you can come back to it later. Procol. So this is the Procol instrument, and it's got, it's the front page, whatever it is, 30 questions. So you rate never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. You go through that. Now, the reason I'm going to show you this is because how you score it is not totally straightforward. So after you complete all of those questions, you actually score it on the third page, not the second page. So you jump to the third page. And your rating for each question goes into a number and a total. It's going to talk to you about a satisfaction level with your job. It's going to talk to you about the likelihood of potential burnout. It's going to talk to you about, hold on one second, my emails are invading my screen. Secondary traumatic stress scale. But you'll see on this very middle one, when you go to score it, so say on question number 1, you gave yourself whatever you gave yourself on question, I'm sorry. So say you gave yourself a 1 on question 1, then you change that to a 5. If you gave yourself a 2, you change it to a 4, etc. Right? So you're actually on these that have the asterisk, you have to flip the score. You're actually going to increase your points or decrease your points depending on what your answer was. So that's the only thing that makes it a little bit tricky when you go to score it. But then it will give you some information about your own potential burnout and secondary traumatic stress. All the ones without the asterisk, you just score as the number you recorded is the number that goes into your total. So I've talked a lot. Those of you, some of y'all are taking it. Some of y'all can take it later. Let me pull back up the screen. Lindsay, thank you for putting the purple back up there. All right. So you should be seeing my PowerPoint screen again. And for the sake of time, we're going to move forward because let y'all do it. So what does the screen mean? So after you score yourself, it's very self-explanatory, but I do encourage you to take it. It's an honest, good self-inventory of where you're at. So if you, if you're looking at compassion, satisfaction, like I said, the protocol talks about the good and the bad. A lot of us got into this work because we are compassionate people and we love it. We thrive on that. And some of that is good and it creates a lot of satisfaction with our work. So if you get some higher scores than that, it'll let you know. If you get some of the lower scores, this is where we start going back to that kind of self-care thing that we tried to ground in last week. Is if you're having problems in your job, then what? Then what's the plan? If you're having burnout, then what's the plan? If you actually have secondary trauma, then what's the plan? I hope that part of the plan is if you're experiencing secondary trauma, you actually have some either really good supervision or really good access to clinical care that you can talk to somebody. We tell people to take care of themselves. There's no reason with us for us not to take care of ourselves. All right. So I'm going to go from the protocol. I'm going to leave that in your hands to figure it out. We're going to get into then. So some of the stuff that we need to look for, and then some of the ways that we move through this and work with it. So people that are experiencing vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, you might have problems with emotional regulation, right? That irritability, that strong emotional reactions either way, totally shutting down, or very angry, overreacting to situations. You might question just self-worth, trouble in decision-making. And I've been fascinated as I've done this work with judges, with police, with clinical folks as well. Our decision-making actually starts slowing down. And that's a problem, right? Especially when we are asked to make sometimes very important decisions in the lives of other people. And our decision-making is affected the more this trauma starts affecting us. Managing boundaries, not knowing when to just shut it down and say enough's enough. Our own relationships. Again, if I would have known some of this stuff earlier on in my career, I may have made a lot of decisions differently than I did. Physical health starts taking a toll. Emotional detachment. One of the things our brain does is it regulates, right? It keeps us safe. It's like enough's enough. Trauma isn't enough. And it starts shutting it down. It's like, I'm not going to have these intense feelings anymore. So we get that numbing or that detachment kind of aspect. So we start what can we do to avoid or address, right, vicarious trauma, secondary trauma? Pay attention, right? Emotional circuits are overloaded. I told y'all last week, I'm the worst about knowing stress. I usually wait until my neck and my shoulders feel it. And by then, yeah, I'm already overloaded. But that's my marker of stress in my body. I feel it and I'm like, oh, too late now. If you go on autopilot, kind of, you're just going through the motions, you're showing up for your job, you're doing your work, but there's no real burning desire that this is going to get any better or anything else. It's that kind of hopeless, helpless thing that creeps into some of the work. This is just one account of somebody kind of describing what it felt like to them, but wanting to tell the stories with great detail, right? So we hear a lot of stuff and we want to talk about it. But we don't want to say the horrific details because our brain's actually starting to protect us from the horror of stuff that we've heard and been exposed to. So we start focusing on kind of glossing over it. And you can imagine, especially in a helping profession where you have to write reports and all, some of those details are critically important. And our brain is like, no, you don't want to deal with those details right now. So we start shutting some of that stuff out. And that's not good for the people that we work with. And then that confused mixture back and forth between being just numb, I can't take this anymore, to being overly sensitive, getting really sucked into a situation. I love this piece from one of the response options when we talk about people responding to people exposed to trauma. Psychological first aid has been around and tested very well. And I love one of their mottos is 1 is none and 2 are none. Sorry, 1 is none and 2 are one. And it's exactly what it says, right? If you're in this alone, sole by yourself, without close colleagues, peers, supervisors, or whatever, and you're trying to do this alone, you are putting yourself in major jeopardy. When you can do this with other people, you can manage this. You can work through some of the details of what you're exposed to at work. And you do this with 2 people, it goes a lot further. And psychological first aid, that literally translates into when you go out into the field to help people that have been exposed to hurricanes, floods, trauma, that you don't go by yourself. You always go with 2 people because they already know and can predict that your exposure is going to cause potential problems for yourself. So you go out as a group. So how do you avoid, y'all said this
My name is
last week.
Debbie H.
Go ahead. Oh,
I think someone accidentally unmuted themselves, Dr. Philippi.
All good. So how do you help avoid, y'all said this last week, and I just want to put the big exclamation point on it, right? Good boundaries, good boundaries, good boundaries, good boundaries. So being able to separate out your work from your life is critical. Now, in the face of a pandemic, a hurricane, floods, freezes, and all that stuff, we're keeping a foot in both doors, right? We've got our own stuff, and then we've got our client stuff, and we've got a foot in both doors. Actually, one of the things that we've been promoting, and it's a deeper dive than what we're doing with all this, is skills for psychological recovery. And we've got groups that have gone through that, but it really talks to the helper about what happens when, how do you survive this keeping a foot in both doors, where you are helping people through trauma, but you are actually experiencing the same disaster, same trauma, all at the same time as a lot of your clients. But good boundaries is huge. Empathy, not taking on your clients' terrible experiences. You can't live their life. It's their experiences, and letting them have them without you taking them on. So being empathic, but not taking it on for your own. Careful, and I know this is so easy to say, and I know a lot of y'all are going to say, oh my God, I don't have any choice in my cases. I get that, but if there's any possibility where you can be careful about how many cases you accept, how many really high trauma, high risk cases you accept, if you have that flexibility, definitely use it. And then everybody has different ways of, what your boundaries are, what your limits are, and you got to figure out what works for you to separate yourself from the work. Y'all talked about some of this last week. ideas about meditation, prayer, music, reading, taking vacations, all those things that are super important to help you just separate yourself from your world of work. This was the slide I was looking for earlier. I thought it was next and I was wrong. But I love this for ours. All of us in the South know this well. So most of us, if not all of us, have ceiling fans in our houses. If you have one in your room especially, you may over-relate to this point. But if you're laying in bed at night and you're staring at that ceiling fan going round and round, and you're thinking about somebody else's trauma, the cases that you've worked with that day, the stories you've heard, and that's what's going through your mind as you're trying to go to sleep and you're pondering all that, watching your ceiling fan spin instead of going to sleep, I would say that you definitely are probably, you've crossed that line already. And I get it happens every once in a while, but when you're taking that much of your work home with you, that's a strong red flag. So you can take the Procol or you can take the ceiling fan test. So I'm going to go back to what we started talking about last week to kind of roll things up. And but you got to take care of you, right? We started talking about this last year, physically, emotionally, personally, workplace, spiritually. You got to take care of you. So some of the things that we know that works well to manage vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, et cetera, is to make sure we observe the good in the world. You know, my wife actually reminded me today, she was like, you know, we're both vaccinated now as because of the work we do and the places we work. And she said, you know, it's going to be really hard when you actually go back to your office every day. That was a nice thought, right? But she's in her office every day, but she's only a very short distance from home. But observe the good. There are good things that have come from this pandemic. There's silver linings in this stuff. We have been more creative than in terms of keeping relationships going than I think maybe we ever have. The ills of social media, as problematic as it can be, has kept a lot of us connected. So there's a lot of good in this world, and there's a lot of good that has come even in the face of disaster. So also being grateful. We know gratitude goes a long way. Just waking up not with everything that's wrong, but what's right. I am so thankful just that, like y'all said, some of the stress you've seen in your own clients. Thankful to have a job, thankful to be working with people, thankful for all the incredible support I have at work and at home. Celebrate your intelligence. Y'all got here for a reason. You're smart people. That's why you're helping people. So you know, celebrating just your own intelligence and the other things that are working in your life, your health, your emotional health, your physical health, if you have it. Realize your emotions may be raw. Give yourself some extra breaks, care. If you do this all day long and you don't have a way to get out, break, leave work at work, you should be raw. And so trying to figure out a different way to recharge yourself and connect with others. I think more than ever, take extra time. If you're already in a high burnout kind of situation, high trauma exposure situation, if you need to take 3-day weekends as much as possible, instead of working 5 days a week and you have that ability, then take 3-day weekends as much as possible. Don't pass on holidays. Don't pass on vacation time, even if it means vacationing at your house right now. Although things are opening back up, and that's good. Other things that you need to pay attention to or could pay attention to: drinking to celebrate versus a tonic for stress. If you're drinking to forget all the stuff at work versus just drinking because, you know, it's the end of the day and I'm hanging out with people that I care about, that's two different things. Spending time with trusted friends. So I know we've got a lot of confidentiality in the work we do, and I'm not suggesting that you tell anybody break confidentiality, but you can talk about your struggles and have people be there to support you too. You know, how hard it is for you to work in some of these environments, how hard it is to hear some of these stories. That's not breaking confidentiality. You're not telling somebody else's confidential information. You're just talking about yourself and how hard it is to hear some of this. If you can get into support groups or therapy, especially if the traumas that you're working with are similar to your own past trauma, that would be important. just so to make sure that those boundaries are kept. What's yours is yours, and what your clients is your clients, and it is different. Making sure that we know that we're not the victim, we can't carry the pain for others, but we can be there and be compassionate while they struggle through it, right? I'm not there to take away people's pain. I can't, but I can be there to support them through it. It's their struggle. So with that, we come to the timely end. Again, trauma is part of life. I'm not telling y'all anything that you don't know. So vicarious trauma is a big threat to the work we do. When vicarious trauma gets too much, it could become secondary traumatic stress, which looks like PTSD. You know, this is part of life. PTSD doesn't have to be, certainly, and vicarious trauma doesn't have to be, but it depends on how we manage it. So I remain very humbled and appreciative of y'all's time and the fact that y'all have been so focused and able to share your stuff in the chat. And I do love this quote, same one we ended on last time, ended on again. Do not judge my story by the chapter you walked in on. Yeah, we've got a lot more story to write here. So I appreciate y'all, and we'll see hopefully a lot of y'all next week.